Hello, everybody. We are live, and we've got Liam Amara with us, and he's been a frequent guest to the channel from when he was running for Congress to now. We had a discussion a few weeks ago, trying to kind of read the bones, as it were, about this, and now, obviously, with developments, it seems like a great time for a follow-up to kind of talk about what's happened, who the players are, what is likely to happen, etc. And just kind of to make this kind of a self-contained segment, it just as a kind of refresher for introductions. Liam, has a past in teaching history, specific in to the Eurasia region, I believe you studied and such. So,
yeah, I'm a historian of Europe and the Middle East.
Yeah, Europe and the Middle East. So yeah, when we were last talking, kind of were speculating that it was more going to resemble a Cold War situation. Obviously, it's changed somewhat in the last 24 hours, but not. So yeah, I'll lead in with that. So kind of pick up from where we left off.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I think that the Cold War analogy still kind of holds, since there were plenty of hot conflicts in the Cold War.
Right.
We focused a lot more last time on the American dimensions of this and what we would do. The ineffectiveness of sanctions, the fact that we weren't likely to go to war over something like this, and a lot less on the regional context. So we can talk a lot more about some of the internal issues in Ukraine, the previous context with Crimean annexation and the Georgian War and tons of other things here that actually do reflect Russia's longer-term interests in the region.
Right.
Because in that, there definitely always was serious potential for a lot more to happen here. But as far as us getting involved, as far as this going from beyond a bunch of rhetoric, I still don't see any real change there.
Right, and with Biden's speech, that basically confirms what was speculated, that yes, heavy sanctions are going to drop, and no, we're almost certainly not going to be getting militarily involved. The cost is just too high. One place I wanted to kind of start from, just as a floor, is the kind of formation of an independent Ukraine, because that actually didn't happen in the contemporary context that long ago. I kind of want, because that leans a little bit into the justifications that are being thrown around by Putin for wanting to go to war, as well as kind of why Ukraine didn't want to become a member state of NATO and such. So yeah, I kind of wanted to grill you a little bit on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
So yeah, the formation of some of the independent states after the fall of the Soviet Union instead.
Yeah, it really depends on how we want to define things, for
Sure.
Whether or not this was a very recent event or not, the creation of Ukraine. I mean, obviously, as a cultural entity, it's medieval.
Yes.
And ultimately, the origins of Russia are in Kiev. But there's continued to be developments and fragmentation of languages, and you ended up with several distinct entities and, three closely related languages, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Russian, all kind of in the same basic area that initially was, kind of around Kievan Rus. So there is something there that's been around for a long, long time.
Yes.
As far as a modern nation state, I mean, the nation state idea is not a very old one itself.
Right.
I mean, it ultimately really goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. So that if the area was part of larger empires, that's kind of like a foregone conclusion, but that's true for almost all of Europe.
Right.
So its existence as an independent state actually goes back to the Russian Civil War. And in the breakup of the Tsarist Empire,
Which,
there was actually a declaration of independence. There was briefly an independent Ukraine, and it was conquered and forcibly annexed to the Soviet Union.
okay.
So there is something there. It never really got to take off, so to speak. But in the Soviet period, there were defined borders. There was a distinct Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic that was part of the USSR, that was understood as a distinct cultural and political entity within the Soviet Union. And that ultimately is the ancestor to the current Ukrainian state, and also why some really troubling issues like Crimea got in there, because Crimea wasn't originally a part of that. It was tacked on by Stalin.
Okay.
Because it just makes a lot more sense physically.
Yeah, geographically,
It's immediately below the Dnieper River. It's connected directly to that western part of Ukraine. So it makes a lot more sense to connect it there. And they just sort of assumed the state would stay whole the entire time anyway, so it wouldn't really matter. That turns out to be not the case.
Right.
But yeah, as a modern nation state, its origins are in 91 in the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Right. So 91. So it's had like 31 years as a independent state in that time, has had considerable pressure not to join any sort of Western alliances. It's been heavily courted,
right?
But you
to
have
some degree.
Well, yeah, but
there was always like fears about it joining too, because of what it would push,
right?
What would happen out of it, but still, yeah.
So we also, so another dynamic there that kind of could be in play is, there is at least some segment of the population that is fiercely nationalistic, that believes very strongly in a independent Ukraine, and joining the EU or NATO probably would be seen as just changing masters. From Soviet Union to them.
Right. It does. There's an interesting split in that kind of hyper-nationalistic branch there, because some do see an expansion toward NATO as guaranteeing their independence from the Soviets. So yeah, it does increase, American domination, but not directly or politically.
Right.
And NATO is a lot looser in terms of its political connections and things like the European Union. We've tolerated, countries that were outright dictatorships as members of NATO all through the Cold War. It wasn't really an issue.
Right.
It's more a matter of this connects you to the U.S. in terms of weapons purchases and the military alliance and things like that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't involve a lot of real compromises in terms of sovereignty or their what path they want to pursue socially or culturally.
Right.
So I can easily see a lot of people there that have those views still favoring some kind of connection there, but others who don't as well.
Yeah. Now, also just to kind of build the floor here, the specific point of contention that Putin is citing in the immediate term is the Donbass region, and I honestly don't know anything historically about why that would be a kind of a specific part that he would call independent. It does seem to be, but this might just be me reading, mostly Western sources and propaganda. I don't know. It does seem to be that it was just flooded with Russian nationals as a justification to call it a place that wanted to be an independent region, in the same way that it kind of was done in Crimea. But do you know any context in which that is a specific sub-region within Ukraine that they're calling a split for? Is there...
I mean, the whole thing is actually a lot messier than that,
okay.
Especially since, settlement in the area is not really driven by by Putin per se, but a longer term phenomenon.
Okay.
Not only across the old Russian Empire, but in the Soviet period. Tons of ethnic Russians settled all across the areas of the former Soviet Union, leaving behind, obviously, ethnic Russian minorities in the former Soviet republics. That's true of Ukraine. Pretty much every part of Ukraine has some Russian minority.
Okay.
But in areas where the Ukrainian language predominates, even if you're ethnic Russian, you're probably going to speak Ukrainian in day-to-day life because the people all around you do.
Right.
Maybe at home, maybe not. The situation in the east of the country is a little bit different. And then the Crimea, we got to sort of like segment out here because Stalin actually deported most of its native population.
Jeez.
They now make up about 10% of the population, and he imported tons of ethnic Russians into it.
Gotcha.
There's also, a quarter of the population of Crimea is Ukrainian anyway, because again, long-term connection to it. It was attached to the Ukrainian SSR, so tons of Ukrainians settled there as well. But the Russian population there goes back to Stalin's deportations. So they've been there for quite a while.
Right.
Although again, not really indigenous. If anything, the 10% or so that are still Tatar, that was theirs originally, but whatever.
Right. Yeah.
But the Donbass region, it's not by much, but a majority of the population technically is ethnically Ukrainian. But many of those ethnic Ukrainians are native Russian speakers, largely because it directly abuts areas that were all ethnic Russian speaking. And the language gradually came to predominate in the area, as well as movements around and settlement of ethnic Russians in the area. So the Russian language is a clear majority of speakers, native speakers in the eastern part of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I don't know, somewhere between 50 and 60% of the population are technically still Ukrainian, even if they speak Russian. So it's really, really hard for us to tell what the people there would actually want. I think that's where Putin's real role comes in. Feeding the separatists, sending in tons of Russian troops without uniforms to kind of like help out those separatist movements. Mm-hmm. That kind of stuff, that's all true. And we don't actually have enough clear data to know, as far as like, I don't know, the old like self-determination of peoples idea, what do the people in that region actually want?
Right.
That's a lot harder to tell. Yeah. Some people have very, very clear positions. They fall nationalistically on either side, which is why we've seen so many like neo-Nazi militias going at it for quite a few years now. I mean, the first peace agreements in the area go back to 2014. this has been a long-running conflict in the area.
And it's obviously very easy to build or skew, say, a survey or something, right, if you're controlling your sample size and the populations you're surveying.
Exactly. We don't have really responsible institutions, or good civil society institutions to do those kind of independent surveys. That infrastructure simply doesn't exist.
Right.
So we have no real way of knowing what random person X in village Y actually thinks about the situation or where they should be. Mm-hmm. We just know the perspective of, militants, militia groups, politicians, people, claiming to be in charge. And yeah, you're obviously going to get very, very skewed views from many of them. Yeah,
absolutely. There's a kind of a larger question that is bubbling all around. And even I was listening on NPR to one of the MPs from Russia, or the MP, discussing the actual goal there. And there's mixed messages about whether it's just securing independence of the Donbass region or taking back all the way, to Kiev to take Ukraine, because they're citing a few concepts which seem to just be designed to muddy language around this, which is like denazifying Ukraine and which seems to just be calling for like regime change with no wanting to negotiate at all, and even like citing Lenin on the concept of like there is no Russia without Ukraine, sort of thing. Like he actually quoted Lenin on that, which was like that seems kind of telegraphing what your actual goals are, but
especially since, again, in 1921, Ukraine was forcibly
Right.
reincorporated into the Soviet Union.
right,
So,
right. But then in the same breath, he was saying that it was just about securing Donbass, which was like, what is happening?
right.
So they're surrounded on three fronts. What? Like, let's talk a little bit about the military situation there, because I'm a little bit curious your thoughts on that. I have my own speculations, but like, obviously, on one hand, Russia technically has more military assets at its disposal. However, as any conflict has ever shown, those on the defense do have a force multiplier just because they have nowhere to retreat to, and they'll fight to every last bullet that they have. So what? How do you kind of see that playing out? Obviously we've gotten very vague information about what's actually going on the ground, but at the moment it does seem like supply lines to Europe are maintained by Ukraine, that they are holding central and western at the moment, but what's your kind of assessment of the ground situation there?
The ground situation will be interesting to watch, and it's one of the parallels that keep coming into my mind from the 08 Georgian conflict. Because the Russian military is chronically underfunded. It's made up entirely of conscript troops, and as you say, they don't have the home team advantage there. They're
Right.
not fighting on their home turf. They're being pushed into it. And while the Russian government is lockstep with Putin on this, because this is a disguised dictatorship, popular support for the conflict is actually quite low.
Okay.
I mean, a few newspapers actually were trying to wander around trying to find anybody on the streets of Moscow that supported this, and we're having a hard time doing that.
Interesting.
And I imagine opinions in the military are similarly mixed,
Mhm.
and that will affect things too. But hell, you had whole like tank groups in the Georgian conflict that were just completely blitzed, drunk. So I don't see a great deal of esprit de corps or real professionalism in the Russian military, but in terms of size and equipment, it does have certain advantages. The Ukrainians have more recently been acquiring and purchasing, Western arms. That's one of the reasons, of course, for NATO expansion is to sell guns. So
Right.
there is that. But I think that ultimately a lot of this will come down to just how well a lot of people fight in the area and how much they're willing to push back. And we already saw because like you said, reports are kind of like scattershot, but there is news we saw about a column of Russian tanks destroyed on the way into Kharkiv, which is just east of Kiev, another major city there. So they stopped that. They also appear to be holding all the port regions, and there's pressure on Turkey to try and prevent any kind of like resupplying from the Russians, through the Bosporus.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine they're going to have some, capacity to continue reinforcing themselves arms-wise,
Right.
and that they will have an easier time recruiting soldiers to defend because this is a defensive struggle for them.
Yeah.
And that, of course, brings in some of the other problems that we can talk about later, because plenty of people that are going to sign up for this are coming out of neo-Nazi militias too. But also the professional army and plenty of ordinary people might participate in that kind of struggle. So they can make kind of like patriotic claims to defense in a way that the Russians really cannot.
Right. Yeah. And especially, I don't know how much of the Russian population is like invested in stocks and such, but the immediate impacts of the sanctions certainly look, at least on a chart, to be substantial.
The central bank was already quickly buying things up, trying to shore up the ruble and the markets, because the Russian stock market
Is bleeding.
currency, is near collapse already.
Yeah.
It's already at its lowest level against the dollar, probably ever. So
Right.
they're going to struggle in some ways there. And the problem here is that those things hurt a lot of ordinary Russians, which of course is one argument against sanctions. It hurts ordinary people, but it's going to do so. And that will decrease a lot of popular support
Right.
for the conflict. There are a few cards that Putin can play, though, to help at least maintain that. And one of them gets back to something you mentioned at the beginning there, the whole idea of NATO expansion.
Yeah.
And that really is the rationale for a struggle like this. Because what you're trying to do here, in order to expand NATO, all the members have to agree. And there are a lot of NATO members who are going to be cautious about wanting to expand further because of the way that it antagonizes the Russians. The move into Georgia effectively scuppered any possibility of Georgia joining NATO. It succeeded.
Right.
And Putin is trying to pull the same thing here. And the similarities are quite marked. And in Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia were both recognized as independent countries. Realistically, they're just satellites of Russia. But they do have distinct ethnicities in the area. So he kind of played on that, broke those territories away, fought Georgian government forces there to, stop to push them back, so that those areas have remained outside of Georgian control ever since. But the real goal is not the small pieces of territory, it's to stop any possibility of further integration into Western alliances. The fact that we incorporated 3 Baltic states, 3 former territories of the Soviet Union itself, as well as a number of former satellites into NATO, is profoundly terrifying to the Russians, because they've never, ever had the military capacity to withstand real conflicts.
Right.
With the Western alliances, there
with a near peer.
Yeah. Right, exactly. I mean, they depend upon the nuclear deterrence with larger powers because they simply don't have the economic strength to last in a large war. The Europeans could probably beat the Russians without us in a conventional conflict. So, and he knows that.
Yeah.
So he wants to stop the movement steadily eastward because we keep planting things like, hell, in Poland, there's missile defense systems already present there. I mean, everything gets closer and closer and closer, which weakens Russia's nuclear deterrent, which in turn, and this is the bigger issue for Putin, it takes him down a peg as a major world power. It's less about, conquest than it is about maintaining Russian influence so that they have a seat at the table, so that they're considered to be relevant. And all they really have is that nuclear deterrence to keep them relevant as a major power. So NATO expansion is a profound threat. And an attack like this will terrify Western European countries about expanding into NATO, even if we have a responsible government in Kiev that asks for it and is willing to do what's necessary in order to get in. You've got European powers that are going to balk at this.
Now,
I mean, look at that again. It's okay. The reason for the 2 separatist parts in Georgia, that's the key issue. If Georgia were to join NATO, it would put us in direct conflict already with the Russians, because Russian troops are in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So if you've got Russian troops, in Donetsk and Luhansk, and Kiev wants to join NATO, sorry, that puts us at war with Russia. No one wants that.
Right. Now, obviously, or not, maybe not obviously, but there are questions going around about why NATO hasn't already come to assist Ukraine. Now, the obvious short answer is Ukraine's not a member state. They can't actually invoke the Defensive Pact, etc. But I kind of was, this is also kind of a question from chat, a little bit about what NATO's history is and function in a conflict like this, that it isn't a member state but is a humanitarian crisis and is obviously a major issue. Being the world police isn't really the mission of NATO.
Right.
Yeah.
It honestly has no actual mission here.
Right.
It was somewhat controversial that they invoked the defensive charter for the Afghan struggle.
It was very, yeah.
Yeah, but there was still some kind of attack on a member state, even though it wasn't technically the government, but the government did aid and shelter the people who did it. So they're like, oh, well, we can do that. And they did get involved. And that already was problematic in a number of member states. So there's not a lot of desire to get involved in things beyond that. NATO was intended to be a defensive pact, at least by the people who signed up for it.
Mhm.
From the US perspective, it's essentially an anti-Russian alliance that allows us to sell guns.
Right.
It's basically just a giant sop to the military-industrial complex in large part, and increases American political influence in those territories. One of the reasons we still have troops all over Europe.
Right.
And military advisors and tons of other capitals and whatnot. It increases our standing. And this is one of the things that Putin most misses about the Soviet Union. One of the reasons he considers its collapse such a disaster is that the Soviet Union used to have people based all over the world, troops in tons of other countries, and they had a significant amount of geopolitical influence.
Mhm.
Russia today is a minor player at best, and they know that. And they want to be back at the table. They want to be talking to the big dogs. So anything that they can do to increase, their influence, the different pacts that they're signing here for like development in Central Asia, the different cooperation agreements are all kind of intended to help repair some of the damage that came to them from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loss of that international influence.
Now, while it could scare some, border countries away from joining NATO, does it actually meaningfully raise Russia's standing? Because it seems like it just makes them even more isolated on the world stage. Like even China seems critical of this move, and like I'm not sure, especially in a globalized economy, if this. I don't know if this is like a misstep or a miscalculation, if that's the goal.
It is to some extent, but that's more thinking in the longer term, and some respect does come from the ability to and the willingness to use force.
Okay.
I mean, it's one of the reasons that the U.S. actually has the position it has, because we have a proven willingness to send troops into other countries. So when we want something, people are like, okay, sure.
Right.
So
True.
It does have a small impact there. As far as the economic aspects of it, as far as the diplomatic stuff, no, this will isolate Russia a bit more, except for its immediate surroundings. It'll help with more integration in Central Asia. It'll help with holding on to Belarus, and it'll help to keep a few other players out of it. And there are concerned to hold on to some of the places that they have. I mean, Russian troops have never left places like Armenia.
Right.
And they want to make sure Armenia stays firmly in their camp. There's a lot of places where there's a potential for losing more influence, and moves like this are designed to stop that erosion.
Okay.
To show that Russia is still a player in its backyard. It does still have the ability to get involved in things like this. So
this is setting an example, basically.
It's kind of setting an example for their own neighborhood.
Right.
In the longer term, if this survives and this kind of government is perpetuated, it could hopefully, from their perspective, allow them to further integrate and regain influence. Think, for example, of some of the early steps that the current Chinese government took. We tend to forget that they invaded and forcibly annexed Tibet.
Yep.
That they did push in militarily in several other places. They fought, border conflicts with not only the Russians, but also with India. There were a lot of conflicts early on that we now completely forgive and forget. And Russia, in the long run, I think, is hoping for something like that, to flex its muscles in its own area, stop the steady erosion of its influence and its connection to parts of the former Soviet Union, and then create a kind of like a new set of facts on the ground, so to speak, such that in the long run, Russia can be reintegrated, globally, with part of that area still in its sphere of influence.
Gotcha. So this is kind of the new faces of imperialism, since there hasn't really been the whole let's go to war and just grab up what land we can, so to speak. It's about maintaining those spheres of influence.
In that sense, it's a very old kind of imperialism.
Right. Okay.
Which, of course, Imperial Russia first expanded into these areas. The Soviet Union fought hard to maintain them and reconquer some of the areas. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to lose the little that they have left. And even if it's only propping up a handful of small breakaway republics, I mean, it actually does accomplish something. What it's done in Georgia actually really tells you that.
Yeah.
Georgian integration into these Western alliances just froze.
Yeah.
It's just stuck there.
The appetite for it is completely gone. Yeah.
Right, yeah, and it can do the same kind of thing in Ukraine. It could stall that permanently, so Ukraine will not have an access to NATO or the EU, but it also isn't really keen to be reabsorbed into the Russian sphere of influence, so it leaves Ukraine as essentially marginalized, and the Russians can claim that it's part of their sphere of influence. And by keeping troops in part of the country, it kind of maintains that illusion, at least internally. We have to remember that Putin's government, and there are problems with the Ukrainian government we should talk about later too, but Putin's government is explicitly neo-fascist. He's been playing with radical nationalism the entire time, playing on this since the 1990s when he first rose to prominence as a prime minister for Yeltsin. Mm-hmm. And those kind of appeals are important because for ordinary Russians, they've been in steady decline for a long time. They're today a dirt poor petrostate. The population is literally falling. Deaths by alcohol poisoning are way up. I mean, they're not a significant player in any way. And Putin wants to reverse that slide, and the tool he's chosen for that is appeals to nationalism, which
necessitate military strongman type tactics.
They kind of do, yeah. Occasionally they do. I mean, it's one of the reasons. Again, he ended up becoming the obvious successor to Yeltsin because of the Chechen conflict, and the way that was played out, and the ferociousness of the Chechen conflict sort of consolidated his position, as the one who can prevent the further dissolution of the Soviet state, or the former Soviet state, further dissolution of Russia, breaking up even smaller and smaller.
Right.
And he has kind of played that role ever since. He's pulled more power away from provincial governors all across the Russian Federation, turned it to where they're directly appointed by him instead of elected locally, as a way of stopping that kind of further separatist stuff there. These continue to maintain troops in a lot of former territories. Their Russian troops have never left portions of Moldova. So it's also in a weird trapped state because portion of it is technically occupied by Russia. Mm-hmm. You've now got that in Georgia. He never pulled troops out of Armenia. I mean, obviously they're deeply tied in Belarus, and there's troops there. Hell, some of the troops that are currently rolling into Ukraine are coming out of Belarus.
Right. Yeah.
So Belarus is effectively already a satellite of Moscow and has been for some time. He's determined to hold on to those, and in that, he has been fairly successful. And the main goal in things like this is less a matter of improving economic standing or really growing as a power, but really consolidating power for the government.
Yeah, okay.
Which is something that neo-fascist governments, in fact, classic fascist governments always struggled with, especially with, and this is something that all of them struggle with, there's no good succession mechanism under fascism.
Right.
So building up some kind of broader framework around nationalism, they're hoping, and then they have to find some way to, eventually Putin goes.
Yeah. I mean, he's 69 years old, I think.
Yeah. Who steps in after that, and then can it hold on to the gains from that? Mm-hmm. That, I think, is the broader concern. Holding on to power, at least for that system.
Right. That's a really interesting perspective, and it's one that I haven't kind of heard discussed because most sources are analyzing this from the perspective of a non-neo-fascist perspective of what is actually being pursued here. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, except
right, but it does.
But it
in
does
the sense of
in that, yeah.
Consolidating power for that government.
Right. Yeah.
These kind of governments, they have to take on these sort of aggressive postures. They have to throw a bone every now and then to Russian nationalists in order to maintain that support and keep that up there. And that helps to maintain his standing.
Yeah.
And as long as he can do at least something to maintain the economic, to keep the economy rolling a little bit, he won't face any sort of major criticism internally. And Putin has already shown that he's quite savvy at dealing with the business side of it as well. When oligarchs step out of line, he has them killed, or he just seizes their assets and they become state assets again, which means that the state has steadily been gaining control over portions of the economy,
right.
Which from his perspective, of course, rolls it back to some of the power that the old Soviet state had.
Yeah.
So there's a weird kind of like almost Nats Bowl sort of like mentality here, where you have, some echoes of the old like state capitalist model, married to a kind of radical nationalism. That can kind of like keep up your support as long as the brawlers in the streets still kind of like you. It's hard to like go against you.
Yeah, that is a sharp edge to dance, though.
It really is. It's not worked out really well pretty much anywhere in the world.
Right.
Fascist states tend to have relatively short lifespans, and they tend to really struggle to pass power to any kind of successor. So it's not really a good situation at all for the Russian people. They're ultimately being screwed. And the whole process, the more that they feed into the nationalist politics, the more it stops the actual improvements in the economy and in the social fabric that would help ordinary people. So, I mean, the real losers in this are Russians and Ukrainians. I mean, because of the approach their governments are taking.
So this is an interesting question in chat about after the Cold War, did the kind of did the First World, using Cold War terminology, bear some responsibility for what happened after Yeltsin, like passing power over to Putin? Could that have been done differently? We talked last time a little bit about actually investing in a region after it's been decimated and trying to to make sure that people are taken care of. It does seem like the goal of the Cold War was just to completely bankrupt Russia and crush it, which usually leaves a power vacuum for a character like Putin to seize on. I'm curious if there's something that the West could have done differently throughout the Cold War conflict to make sure that Russia didn't end up just in a destitute power vacuum.
I mean, we could have found some way actually to cooperate and more directly embrace the initial attempts to move away from the Soviet past. And instead, there's a significant faction that always wanted to maintain a kind of adversarial relationship.
Right.
And ultimately, Putin is kind of right to point to NATO expansion as a prime driver of this. Because if the Soviet state had collapsed, and the Cold War had already ended before the Soviet state collapsed, so if that isn't there anymore, and if the economic system isn't there, which was the justification for the entire Cold War anyway, if you've managed to defeat the economic threat, then why expand NATO to its frontiers? Why push further east there? What it did was it played directly into the hands of nationalists. And what that did was it gave them no real incentive to tackle the corruption and to actually solve any ordinary problems, because you could play on something else in order to hold on to power. So you end up with this extremely corrupt crony elite under Yeltsin, and the West bears a tremendous amount of responsibility for the disaster under the almost decade under Yeltsin, because we prefer to kind of shock treatments to the economy, which threw tons of people off of benefits that they depended upon. People lost healthcare, they lost pensions, they lost their jobs, and the actual living standards plummeted. It actually has created a substantial kind of nostalgia for the Stalinist era, because for all the horrific crimes of the Stalinist period, living standards actually climbed for a lot of ordinary Russians.
Yeah.
And they started to fragment near the end and fray at the end, later in the Cold War period, but they only really sharply fall, under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And that's there's a real lesson in that. If we had actually, honestly, when there was negotiating the whole let's draw back from this whole Cold War thing in the 1980s, if we at that point had just just clear the slate, okay? Set this stuff aside. Don't think in terms of NATO or adversarial stuff and really just kind of embraced, a reformist Soviet state, you might have ended up with something, a bit more social democratic, and in its basic character, a bit more democratic, that could have held on to the basic living standards for ordinary people if we had actually seriously invested in Russia.
Right.
Instead, though, there's a real incentive amongst both power elites in the major Western capitals, amongst tons of the different defense contractors obviously play a part in that, and certain banking interests and whatnot there, to sort of basically play the thing up for their own short-term benefit, and they did that. And by pursuing some of that short-term benefit, we sacrificed the long-term possibility of integrating Russia peacefully into an international framework. We maintain this adversarial posture, which only pushes them into the hands of neo-Nazis.
Yeah.
Because they, again, people remember the respect the Soviet Union had, and they know they live in a shithole now. And they don't want that. Understandably, what they're doing is only going to make it worse. That's kind of a separate point. So there's no defense of the Putinist approach in any of this.
Right.
But it's sort of like, at least psychologically understandable, why a lot of people would fall for what he's saying. Because,
well, sure.
Whole generation now has grown up.
There's a kernel of truth in it.
Sort of, yeah.
Even though even though Putin and the power structures there could do a lot to actually help Russia out. Or
everything could have been done better on both sides.
Yeah.
But you're right. There's a kernel of truth to it, because what he can do is he can point to the steady expansion of NATO as a direct threat against Russia as Russians, not as because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. If the Cold War was about two competing economic models, right, and that's realistically what its rationale was all along.
That's what it was framed.
We talked a lot about freedom, but ultimately it was a fight between two economic models for the global economy. If that's no longer the case, but we are continuing to threaten the Russians, then Putin can basically frame this as we're victims and we're being oppressed by other people, and we have to stand up and defend ourselves. While it's, again, an exaggeration and none of it defends what he's doing, there is that kernel of truth to it. And that ultimately is driven by, in part, inertia. People just have a hard time changing the way they're approaching things. And two, a lot of short-term profit from people who aren't really thinking of the consequences of their actions.
Right. So, that kind of does raise the question, because does NATO itself make sense? Yeah, if the Soviet Union and if that whole economic threat has fallen, how do you justify continuing something created explicitly to combat that? So and
there really isn't one.
There isn't.
We have to point to the threat of Russia to justify continuing NATO and the different spending that props it up, right?
Right.
So to do that, and this is where, again, policymakers, there are some calculated choices here. And a lot of it is driven by kind of like short-term logic, but there is a real calculation here to keep Russia feeling threatened, because it justifies continuing to maintain that alliance. European Union makes a great deal of sense in terms of ending war, ending the possibility of war in the European peninsula. That did the job, not NATO.
Yeah.
And realistically, the Soviets were never really a military threat to the rest of Europe, only to the satellite territories that they'd taken during World War II. So if that's gone, and the European Union can steadily expand and integrate territories there, then there is realistically no threat of war in Europe. But if you can maintain really antagonistic postures toward places like Russia and Belarus, then it justifies that continuing alliance. Because ultimately, from our perspective, from an American state perspective, it's about feeding the military-industrial complex and about maintaining American influence on the ground. We still have troops in Europe since World War II. They were there initially to defend against the Soviet threat, which clearly no longer exists. Why are we there?
Right.
Because Russians are still bad. So realistically, had we integrated Russia, you asked that, could we have done something better? Had we actually, offered the olive branch and really cleared the slate?
Yeah.
then
It's like,
the rationale for NATO dissolves completely.
yeah, it's like, okay,
And so
you're
does American
dissolving the
influence.
Soviet Union. We're going to drop NATO. Let's
Right.
meet on friendly terms and figure out how to move forward.
Right.
Yeah.
And what that does is it takes us out of Europe, where right now we still have a massive influence on Europe's political direction and economic direction because of the military connections we have to so many EU states. If we weren't there, the simple fact is the European Union has a larger population and a larger
Sure.
economy than we do, and they would actually be able to chart their own course.
And
We don't really
should
want
be
that.
able to, but yeah.
And should, but it's not really in our political interest to allow that.
For the American state. Yeah.
From the American state, exactly, which means that our approach to Russia has been predicated on that entire framework, maintaining that framework, maintaining that hostility. And again, none of this defends the Russian state, which has
Sure.
been a corrupt gangster state all along.
Right.
It could have gone a different way, but who knows?
Yeah.
But the point is, if we can maintain that kind of threat, it's to me, it's similar, just analogically to the situation with Iran. The Iranian government is deeply, deeply problematic, but we make it worse by backing them into a corner, which feeds the arguments of reactionaries and nationalists there. So it keeps the hardliners in power because it gives us a useful enemy in the area and justifies military spending. Now we can keep aircraft carriers in the Gulf. If Iran wasn't played up as a major threat, then we would have a lot harder time justifying keeping our troops in all those bases in the Gulf and hence our direct influence on the political structure of the Arab Gulf.
Yeah, framing it in terms of power and influence, I think makes a lot of sense, and it starts when you start analyzing it from that perspective. Things do click into place a lot better. So
At the end of the day, this is about great power politics, which
Right.
hasn't changed as much as we think since the class
uh,
have shifted around a bit. Some of the specific issues have shifted around,
there we go.
but the basic framework hasn't changed much, of how you do things and why you do them.
Right.
So maintaining our influence in whole regions, which by extension gives us a significant amount of economic influence. I mean, using Iran the way we do keeps us firmly entrenched in the Arab Gulf, and makes us indispensable to that entire region.
Right.
Where we don't have to be. There's no reason we need to be there. It's the same thing with Europe. Europe absolutely can take care of itself politically, militarily, economically. It doesn't need us there, but we want to be there. So we have to maintain the overall threat structure.
Despite this, despite that being kind of the purpose of maintaining those tensions and such, I do wonder if that's going to start raising questions, and I'm hopeful it starts raising those sorts of questions about should that sort of continue to be maintained, if obviously we're just going to stand by when Russia does in fact force project. It's like if your rationale for maintaining troops in the area and such is to be a counter to Russian expansion and such, and then no action is taken, it should at least raise questions towards the US about maybe you should.
Not really, though.
No?
Because we have always assumed that places like Ukraine and Belarus are still in the Russian orbit. Thinking in terms of like defending Ukraine, a lot of what's been coming out of here, and this is where I kind of dismissed a lot of like the Biden-esque rhetoric last time, there's no realistic prospect of us genuinely caring. I mean, Ukraine is simply not a part of those Western alliances. It's not integrated into the West.
True.
It's realistically per capita probably the poorest country in Europe, or like closely tied with Moldova. So there's not a lot of advantage there, even though there's tons of resources, tons of potential. It could be better than it is, but it's just no one really is trying to integrate it. What it does, though, is it keeps us on the ground in the areas we've already expanded to.
Okay.
And it more tightly knits us into those areas. Especially since, and you can do this with nationalistic governments from Estonia to Poland to Hungary, all across Eastern Europe. It puts them more and more in bed with us. deepens our influence on the ground, just as in some Western European countries, our influence has actually declined a bit. People do have a harder and harder time justifying their close connection to us because they don't really feel threatened anymore. That the old rationales for things like NATO don't make sense to a lot of people in Western Europe, but they do in the East. And as long as they do, and we got those countries in, it's one of the reasons we push so many countries to join NATO early on, is it puts us on the ground, it increases our influence among people who do feel threatened, which continues to justify the existence of the entire alliance structure.
Now, let's roll a worst case sort of scenario. Russia fully annexes, either just as a puppet state or just straight annexes Ukraine. That puts a lot of border stress between Ukraine and, neighboring. That would actually kind of contradict Putin's red line of not having any borders with NATO states, I think. And I don't know what that would look like.
Yeah, I don't think there's any realistic prospect of outright annexation. And I think the best you can hope for is something closely akin to a puppet state. Because the situation with Belarus is actually quite desirable to Putin. He basically has it as a part of Russia without having it as a part of Russia.
It's just a border state that is...
It's a buffer state in the same way that the old Warsaw Pact used to be a buffer state.
A vassal.
Right.
Yeah.
And you kind of had that under Yanukovych, before the whole Maidan uprising, the whole revolution of dignity, however you want to call that, before they tossed Yanukovych. I mean, he had a politician that was very comfortable being very cozy with Russia and no real interest in NATO integration.
Right.
And that's the ideal solution for Putin. So I think the worst case is actually a term you used at the beginning here, regime change. If they do actually manage to push in and topple the government, and do something like we did in, I don't know, Iraq or whatever, and
or all of South America.
Yeah, exactly. This is one of the things that's sort of like amusingly hypocritical about us complaining about this sort of thing, is that we have done it a lot all around the world, but whatever. If they do that, and you can kind of see a good rationale for that, restoring a more pro-Moscow government, even if it isn't exclusively pro-Moscow, even if it's sort of like just on the border, it gives you a situation again where you can stretch out the status quo indefinitely, which again is similar to places like Armenia and Georgia for various reasons. It keeps them able to trade with Western powers, play on the international stage, but still be directly in Moscow's shadow. And I think that's what he wants with Ukraine. Ukraine is simply too large a territory. It has too many, ethnic Russians in there, and there's too close of historic connections between them for him to want it to be fully integrated into an expansive like NATO or EU framework. But I don't think that they want to outright annex it.
Right.
It'd be far too problematic, and it would give them, at the end of the day, the Ukrainian population is quite large, and they don't want to be Russians.
Yeah.
Even if they're kind of like iffy on everything else, it would be too difficult to hold on to. So maintaining that illusion of true independence, as he is with places like Belarus, is ultimately far more desirable. Whether he does that, that's a bigger question.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the bombardment here could be just a matter of forcing a government to step back from its positions, maybe internally change its own structure here, fire a few people, and ultimately acknowledge that they have no real chance of getting back Crimea or the Donbass. That's I think a more realistic short-term ambition. Yeah, what it does is though it creates one of these weird long-term situations, and there are, I can name a dozen situations like this around the world where there are places that are de facto functionally independent but are still recognized as part of another country, and we can never move on from that. And what it does is it permanently retards any kind of real international development or integration. It leaves countries in a weird kind of limbo state where they can't really develop much. And that also is kind of in Russia's interest. So if it can get Ukraine to acknowledge that it can't get these territories back, but we still maintain the illusion that Crimea and the Donbass are part of Ukraine, then Ukraine is just stuck in limbo unable to move realistically in either direction.
How similar is that to, say, something like Puerto Rico, or in the case of like China to Taiwan or something?
Those are, I think, a little bit different, especially since they don't really involve separatist movements per se. I mean, a little bit in the case of Taiwan, but I mean, functionally, it's been, de facto independent for longer than a lot of countries in the world have existed. I mean, when Taiwan became functionally, divorced from the rest of China, most of Africa was still colonized. So it's been like that for a long time now.
Yeah, true.
The situation there with like Puerto Rico is much more of a almost a colonial framework that's simply advantageous to a lot of people on the ground, because there are certain benefits to being a commonwealth and not a state. They would have more political influence in the country, but they would actually lose a few things economically. And it is quite a poor area. So a lot of people are more like, status quo is kind of fine. I mean, where in Taiwan, there's actually a significant portion of the population that's pro-independence, like formally declared independence, not just de facto. In Puerto Rico, it's actually a very tiny part of the overall population. The only way you can get real majorities for independence is people boycotting it.
Right. Okay.
Because it's pretty well split, between like three possibilities.
Yeah.
And there's no real issues of like military threat to it.
True.
Where you do have that for places like Taiwan. I mean,
True.
There's a lot of missiles pointed at Taiwan. And I think that's the only main reason the government is not ever going to go for it. They recognize that until Beijing accepts that Taiwan is independent, they have no option but to maintain the status quo.
Gotcha. There are a few folks kind of talking about China's response to all of this going on, and it seems to be a little bit of a mixed message. On the one hand, they are wagging their finger, they're condemning it, etc. On the other hand, I haven't seen them joining on like the sanctions bandwagon. I suspect they're going to keep trade open and will kind of be Russia's supplier for the near and future.
Which I think is part of the rationale for some of the finger wagging, because it allows them to say they're kind of on the right side, so to speak, but they can maintain those trade links, which ultimately is more beneficial to them. Because China wants to continue to increase its influence in Central Asia, which is also Russia's backyard.
Right.
And the two of them working together in that region, ultimately benefits both powers as well as the autocrats holding on to power in that region. And I don't think they want to sacrifice that. On the other hand, China's a really big proponent of the whole how do you want to put this? Okay, look at some of the powers that have a really hard time recognizing any kind of secession movements. Places like Spain still can't recognize Kosovo, which has been de facto independent and recognized by quite a few countries for a long time, because of Catalonia. They don't want that kind of possibility of part of their own country breaking away and being recognized.
Right.
And China's in a similar situation, because obviously East Turkestan / Xinjiang province is not terribly happy being there. Plenty of Tibetans would rather be independent, even if the government has dropped down their demands to only like, hey, we'd like some autonomy and cultural freedoms here. A lot of Tibetans are still unhappy with the situation.
Well, sure.
And then you've got the whole Taiwan issue, which, technically on paper we all recognize as part of China, but it's obviously not.
Yeah.
And they want to maintain that sense of
unity,
territorial integrity. Right. So criticizing Russia for threatening Ukraine's territorial integrity over an ethnic issue, they have to do that. Because it's the same situation that they would have with the complaints around Taiwan and Tibet.
They're being ideologically consistent there. I see.
Right. They have to take that kind of position regardless of the amount of trade. But they do obviously still want to maintain they want to look like they're on the right side there too. But they will continue to deal with the Russians.
So I want to touch on one tiny bit of kind of silver lining that obviously it's the whole thing is fucked and a human tragedy, but There is one thing that I was reading, which is that this appears to be lighting a fire under the EU to move towards green energy even faster, to reduce their reliance on oil, etc. Money, is the motivator there. It's finally becoming too expensive because of this conflict to continue on oil.
It doesn't take a lot. I mean, what's the largest economy in Europe? The Germans.
Right.
How dependent are the Germans on Russian gas?
Extremely.
Way too much. So, I mean, and they've already taken, an interesting step in canceling one of the Nord Stream 2.
Yeah.
But there's no way this is one of the reasons that military action was never going to be on the
they
possibility.
Can't afford to.
The Germans would have vetoed that.
Yeah.
Because it would be far too risky for them. So yeah, if it pushes people more and more away to other energy sources, yeah, you're right. There is a silver lining there.
Yeah. I am also curious because it sounds like it's also spiking U.S. oil prices, which it seems. I still never quite follow how that happens because we are such a major producer. I guess it just is because it increases demand everywhere. So
it's an international economy. The banking sector that controls the oil markets is a significant problem. That's international, and prices in one place do affect them everywhere else. Mm-hmm. I mean, our prices shot way up during the old that crisis in the 70s. Mm-hmm. When OPEC cut production. Yeah. Over the 73 war, we were a major oil producer then too. And realistically, we're constantly involved in the Middle East, but we don't depend upon them for oil at all.
Right.
We get a lot more from like Mexico, Canada, Venezuela. Hell, we import oil from Russia.
Right.
We don't take a huge amount from the Arab Gulf, but Japan does, and the Western Europe does.
Is there any possibility we might see a renewed or reinvigorated push towards getting away from oil here? No.
Not with the parties that we have. No.
Okay.
I mean, not with the kind of neoliberal Democratic Party. They're still they still want the whole like energy independence that comes from us being a major oil producer. I mean, it doesn't. They can talk all they want about green stuff, but we elect a Democrat in California. They want offshore drilling. You elect a Democrat in D.C. and they want more pipelines and more drilling in the. I mean, it's
clean fracking.
Right. It's just a matter of trying to look good and look like they care enough and maybe increase some investment in other areas. Mm-hmm. But they aren't going to move realistically away from oil. And part of that is international, though, because it's a major threat to the global economy. Think, for example, of how many major economies are entirely dependent upon petrochemicals. The Arab Gulf would collapse without those exports. Mm-hmm. And its collapsing economically would cause massive political upheavals and possibly wars in the area. At the very least, civil wars, major unrest, regime changes there. Russia's a petrostate, and it's a nuclear-armed petrostate. If that oil can't flow out, if that gas can't flow out to other markets, then there's no money to maintain the control over the Russian nuclear arsenal. Those computers degrade even further, and the risk of nuclear holocaust shoots way up.
Now,
the global economy is simply too tightly, connected to oil.
I'm paraphrasing you a little bit here, but it sounds like you're suggesting that global capitalism actually creates terrible incentives, and if you ever try and detangle from it, it creates human suffering by design in order to perpetuate it.
I mean, yeah, that's there, but it's like it's even more complicated than that because it also connects into the political structures. Mm-hmm. The close ties between the nation states and international capitalism. The corporate structure there, mm-hmm. and then it's being built around a handful of key commodities. It's very difficult to disentangle those three from each other. So it's one of the reasons too, and it's not just oil and gas issues. I mean, look at how hard it is for us to tackle things like deforestation.
Right.
Because if you were actually to get, to help Indonesians stop burning their forests, then we would have less palm oil for tons and tons of products. If you actually helped the Brazilians to stop deforestation, the price of a McDonald's hamburger might go up, and heaven forbid the price of a hamburger go up for Americans, so we cannot tolerate that. The corporate aspects really affect the politics.
One of the chatters asks, what are the three commodities you mentioned?
Not only the commodity flow, like the things like fossil fuels as a commodity, but their tie into a neoliberal corporate structure, which we've been building up steadily since the Second World War and giving more and more power, such that today more than half the largest economies in the world are corporations, not countries. And then their influence in political circles. So the international political order. This is one of the reasons too that you end up with so many bullshit situations where we have to pretend the situation is different than it is. Like, hell, northern Somalia has been independent for 30 years, but we can't recognize that. I mean, the political structure is so tied into a broader economic framework in the world that it forces really weird political decisions over and over again, and it's really hard for people to see how they're connected and why they are the case. It ends up creating all these situations where, why do we do that? Well, there actually is a logic to the state's actions, but it's because it's so tied into global trade in commodities that goes back all the way into the imperial period and the corporate structure that we've built up around neoliberalism.
Right. Yeah.
So in the sense of, you're bringing up global capitalism, you're right in the sense that we can't make real progress on tons of political issues or environmental issues without addressing the economic one. And we're still stuck in this weird binary where it's either like neoliberalism or Stalinism, which is obviously also bullshit.
Right.
But
there are other choices.
There are other choices. There are other ways we could organize the global economy than neoliberalism, but we've fallen so much for, just in general, the overall populace has fallen so much for those weird binaries that it's very difficult to get serious reform through.
Yeah. Not to mention the fact that any country that seriously tries to stray out of capitalism gets instantly, like, every major capitalist power trying to crush it.
Right. Yeah, it's honestly remarkable that any of them manage to survive at all. The fact that Cubans have a longer life expectancy than Americans is just like, holy shit, they're doing something right.
Yeah.
They have a terrible government in terms of like political repression, censorship, and everything else, but they're at least meeting a lot of ordinary people's basic needs. They have the same caloric intake as Americans, a longer life expectancy, better health care. So it's hard to actually, for them to move away from it too. So it just maintains that old binary between, neoliberalism and Stalinism. You're stuck with that dictatorship because any attempt to reform it would lead to something similar to what happened in the Soviet Union. You collapse completely into a corrupt gangster state that can be manipulated by, international finance and capitalism. This is one of the reasons that the Russians are ultimately in a really tight pickle here, and you can see them lashing out in weird ways, is that they understand the degree to which they depend upon these international finance markets. They understand the degree to which they depend upon selling oil and gas.
Right.
And it makes them profoundly weak in a sense. So, this is something that some of those states are trying still to prevent. But yeah, any attempt at trying a different path, no matter what it really is, has been met with so much violence and resistance.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think the only model that's ever really been tolerated is social democracy. You see the stronger welfare states of a lot of European countries, in the West and in the North.
Yeah, Scandinavia especially.
Right, because they are so capitalist. They're perfectly happy, dealing with everybody else, that we kind of like ignore all the different socialist aspects as well. We can kind of swallow that because they've never pulled away from the international financial order. They've never pulled away from the international trade order that feeds into the control of these giant multinationals. And unless you're criticizing that, you're not really a threat. That's the freedom that we were fighting to defend in the Cold War, really.
I do wonder if that could, over some period of time, be a bridge to, at some point, shake free of the capitalist chains that bond the world. But that could be wishful thinking.
Hope for that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people hope for that. I see no realistic prospect there.
Yeah.
Because that particular approach, while it does lead to better human development, greater education, healthcare, opportunities for ordinary people, they have a higher standard of living than we do for a reason.
Yeah.
But it doesn't give them any possible out from neoliberalism. It doesn't give them any possible out from a framework of international capitalism, because their whole structure depends upon it.
Okay.
So it's still a kind of trap.
Yeah.
Your living standards would still be better, but
Yeah.
it doesn't ultimately change that aspect. And until you change that, it's hard to make any real political reforms either.
Right, because everything is still rooted in the idea of ownership and power.
Right.
Basically.
It's still basically a proprietarian order. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was another comment in chat which sparked a thought and a question that or something that I wanted to kind of just pick your brain about, which is the Kenyan UN ambassador was heavily critical of trying to draw borders based on ethnic lines in the first place. He gave a very good speech about it. I listened to it a couple times, and that has been a very frequent casus belli for different nation states. But like, are we? Is there an appetite to move away from that type of thinking? Because that is an increasing criticism from many people, is drawing up these borders just based on, well, we're different, therefore you don't cross this line. Like, is there a move away from ethno-nationalism, which I know, like, Russia isn't per se strictly an ethno-nationalist state, but they do use a lot of that rhetoric, and a lot of nation states, even the United States, does flirt with those kinds of, especially our Republican Party, flirts with those sorts of sentiments. Is this a conflict that can highlight the dangers of thinking in terms of ethnicity for that?
It can, if people take that lesson, and it's one of the ways where, because I've seen a number of people making parallels to World War II,
mm-hmm.
and it's if this continues, this has the potential to be easily the largest conflict in Europe since World War II.
Well, it's the largest ground invasion since then.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and you've got the a very clear ethno-national basis in it, similar to like the claims over Sudetenland and the Anschluss with Austria and that sort of thing, that where you can point to these different ethnic regions where there's a majority of Russian speakers, this and that, and they should be part of our sphere of influence. It does have certain parallels there. If we focus a little bit on that in a way that can divorce it from some of the political framework, though, it would be helpful, because a lot of people are going to use that very, very cynically, and at the same time continue to feed into that nationalist logic. This is something I've been lecturing on actually recently in some classes. I just was last night talking about this, and we even talked a bit about Russia in this framework, as well as a number of other places. The overall danger of ethno-nationalism, that it has consistently been a disaster for ordinary people, and that Balkanization ultimately, it traps you as well. Not only does it feed tons of direct violence, tons of like internal sectarian violence where you're othering people, you have to maintain that sense of like, enemies, internal enemies aren't like me. But the more you break yourself up into these smaller states, the easier it is to kind of like, push you around within the framework of a giant, global capitalist system. So it honestly casts you adrift even more. It makes it even harder to change the overall system. So this is one of the reasons that nationalism has actually been actively encouraged in a lot of places across the 20th century, even though it has caused horrific conflicts.
Yeah.
The more that you can maintain at least those senses of difference, particularly all across the global south and in the different parts of the developing world, the more you can maintain that, the more increases dependence on, the corporate bodies coming out of the old Europe, the old imperial metropoles. The more it allows them to continue to dictate terms. Realistically, larger, more cosmopolitan entities would stand a better chance of either going their own way, finding their own kind of solutions, or at least punching above their existing weight internationally. So there is a good argument for that. And realistically, the world has always been broken up into tiny, tiny chunks of people. As soon as you move 50 miles away, your language is going to begin to diverge until you get into, like, I don't know, modern global. We're all glued into the internet and satellite TV and everything else. But for most of human history, that's been the norm.
Right.
Which means that there's still a tremendous amount of diversity around the world. But look at the success of a number of the more powerful European states, right? I mean, who are our bigger players there? The Italians, the French, the Germans, right? They're actually all inherently multinational, multi-ethnic states.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got a couple dozen languages spoken across Italy. Most people at home, they're going to speak Friulian, Venetian, they're going to speak Neapolitan, Sicilian, you use modern standard Italian in the media and code switching in public. But they were all already, multi-ethnic states, but linked together, focusing on a few things they have in common, it does make for a stronger entity, which ultimately increases, their influence in the world. There's a lesson to be taken from that in calling for these larger states, and look at the success of some,
and the EU in general,
imperiled in some ways. But
yeah,
I mean, look at how well India has actually managed to survive as a country.
Yeah.
For all of its problems, for all of its massive poverty, for all of its increasing Hindu nationalism and everything else, it has managed to hold together a territory about the size of Europe with a tremendous profusion of cultures and languages.
Yeah.
There's no reason larger entities can't happen. And Russia itself, as you say, it is actually a large multinational state. It has a Russian majority.
Sure.
But there's a ton of languages spoken all across Russia and always have been. And even nationalists like Putin acknowledge that, and they say Russia is a multi-ethnic state and it's going to stay that way. And so I don't know, there is an interesting model that I would like to see pursued more, because tackling the economic system or the political order of the world are difficult. And obviously, it's hard to push back against, a Leviathan like that. But if you tackle it in maybe some different ways, maybe if we talked a bit more about cosmopolitanism, maybe if we got past some of the ethno-nationalism first, and we focused on solving some of those cultural and social issues first, stopped othering people, then maybe we could later find a path to addressing the economic issues. But as long as it's so easy for us to be manipulated, to mentally colonized into balkanizing ourselves and othering other people and like turning on our neighbors, as long as it's so easy to manipulate us into that. I used a fun parallel yesterday with the Irish. Because if you physically look at them, the Irish don't look much different from the English and the Scots. I mean, they don't stand out. But all it takes is opening your mouth and someone says, you're Irish. And then all these weird racist tropes that they pick up from the propaganda come into play. And you're able to kind of like push people apart and not see any kind of like commonalities, not find solidarity. It's very easy to build a kind of like tribalistic mentality in us, because it builds on something evolutionary. I mean, we used to exist in small bands that were competing with each other when we were hunter-gatherers, right? And those don't have to be biological. You can always incorporate people into a tribe, but the fact that there is a communal aspect. At the end of the day, humans are herd animals, right? But there's the dark side to that is it can be manipulated through propaganda. It can be manipulated through education. You can create antagonistic relationships socially between other groups of people. And as long as they get us fighting each other and we don't start thinking of our broader commonalities, then there's no possibility of tackling the really big problems with the international order.
Right.
So that if there's something good to come out of that, I'm tempted to agree with you and hope for something like that maybe we can start breaking down some barriers there. But that has to be a decision that we make as people.
Right.
Because, our powers that be are never, ever going to agree with that, because nationalism serves their interests.
So that could be at least a useful context to discuss and criticize this sort of action, aside from everything else, just saying, that ethnicity is not a justification to go to war. It just and and using that as a springboard to talk about the problems that come with ethno-nationalism and
it'd be nice if we could start to critique those concepts themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, ethnicity, race, and nation are all flexible, interchangeable social constructs.
Yeah.
They can all be used in the same basic way. You could talk about the French race versus the German race, or they're talking about them as ethnicities, or talking about them as nations.
And they're manufactured divisions.
Exactly, just manufactured categories.
Yeah.
Right? It's when you tie our actual differences, the fact that we speak a different language, when somebody turns that into a political project, that's where things like, race and nation come into play.
Mm-hmm.
And you manufacture a political identity out of that. The reason to do that is to create antagonisms, to create conflicts.
Right.
If we can find a way to
you create
those,
and you create those conflicts in order to consolidate power, typically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To consolidate, it used to be, you can consolidate power in terms of like the broader imperial frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
The great empires all did this. They all exacerbated tensions between people, helped to manufacture sectarian identities so people would go against each other. Think about like the French in Syria, creating a political identity out of Druze, Alawite, Sunni, identities. Or think about the, look at, so people have heard of like the Rwandan genocide, right? And the whole like Hutu versus Tutsi thing. What actually is the difference between Hutus and Tutsis? Nothing. Fuck all. It's completely invented. It was invented by Europeans. There's no actual difference there. But you get into their heads that someone is different, and I'm different than you, therefore I'm better than you, and there you create the potential for conflict. You create those conflicts in order to justify maintaining the imperial framework, because they become dependent upon the outsiders to keep the peace. Mm-hmm. In our neo-imperial period, we've moved away from a lot of direct political control and moved into a period where these international political frameworks and the organizations, as well as like global capitalism and whatnot, that's the framework you need to maintain. And as long as people are still fighting each other, as long as there's still conflict between countries or within countries, then it maintains dependence upon that international order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It gets to be nasty stuff, really. But, at the end of the day, if enough of us can find a way to build, real solidarity internationally, to build a kind of like cosmopolitan mentality, it at least has the potential to erode some of the justification for those webs of control. But as long as it's so easy to manipulate us into hating people who aren't like us, then those networks of power are in no way threatened.
So, again, just paraphrasing you, the international workers class unite and rise up. Yes? Am I?
I don't, not necessarily. I mean, again, there's any number of ways of looking at that. I mean, there is at least something to this idea of division along class lines also, creates tensions and easily. I mean, look at how easily Stalin manipulated that into massacres of populations he didn't like.
Yeah,
I mean, you can misuse that too, but yeah, kind of like if we just recognize, hey, I work for a living, you work for a living, we both have a boss, the bosses are ultimately controlling all of us, and maybe that's the enemy and not you and I, Right. There's something there.
There.
But it does have a potential for misuse as well.
It does. I'm just, I just like to, yeah.
No, I get it. I get it.
Yeah. All right. So, do you have any additional thoughts? And chat, do you have any questions that we want to pose? We've been going about an hour and a half. I'm kind of run out of questions. I feel like this is a pretty good analysis of what's currently going on, and kind of trying to read the tea leaves about what could happen.
Right, yeah. And you did raise a few interesting questions here about NATO, about the larger objectives there. Mm-hmm. I think the most realistic one is to maintain, control in some of these quasi-independent territories to like hold Ukraine in a weird kind of like liminal state where it can't go in any direction. But it does have the potential of toppling the government and regime change too, and we should keep that in mind. And really, as far as like a power play, the impact on NATO should not be understated there, because this really will soil the support for the idea of expansion further,
right,
of moving it into that area, because no one if you can see Putin is absolutely willing to go to war like this,
you don't want to risk your cities. Yeah,
you don't want to risk it. And realistically, in a state like that is so fragile, the Russian state is extremely fragile, they don't have as much to lose.
Yeah,
it's sort of similar in some ways to the situation with like North Korea. I mean, that state, its sole purpose is to like preserve its own power.
Yeah, if your back is against the wall.
Control.
Yeah.
Right. You do what you have to do. And I think Russia knows that we're not likely to press that button in terms of a nuclear conflict. It would stay pretty conventional if a conflict broke out. So it's going to terrify a number of European powers. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, of course, it's going to sell a lot more weapons to Eastern European countries, which the Americans will love.
Yeah.
And it's given us the ability to place more troops and more missile defense stuff and everything else across Eastern Europe.
Yeah,
but
well,
the losers here really are the Ukrainian people, and I just
absolutely.
For me, it's like if you're thinking like, what's the last thing that I really want to say?
Yeah,
gosh, I mean, I just my heart goes to people that I mean, you got thousands of people that are going to die here from like missile bombardments and troops rolling into their areas, and Russian troops are not going to behave themselves well. They are poorly paid conscripts.
Yeah, that reminds me. I just posted a link to Operation Solidarity, a link tree in the chat for folks. If you are looking for a way to get, if you want to support the people of Ukraine, that's set up by local activists and anarchists to try and help people out. So, yeah.
And we should absolutely do everything we can to help out, like anti-war people there, the mutual aid societies, anything we can do there. But for God's sake, anybody paying attention to this, don't fall for a lot of the propaganda too about how we need to like prop up the Ukrainian government.
Right.
Worrying about the impact on ordinary Ukrainians. Yes, I am 1000% with people there, but there are literal neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian government.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like there are bad guys on one side and good guys on the other. Putin bad, Ukrainian government also bad. I mean, when like your prime minister or whatever are showing up to literal like white supremacist rallies.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. And I mean, I don't know, look at the whole kerfuffle they had for a long time over like the language laws or whatever, trying to push it through so Ukrainian is the only language, which is similar to what some other territories did. The Estonians did that. Push it through so Estonian was the only language there. And like, I don't know, 15% of the country are like Russians, and they're like, what about us?
Yeah, and that's all about like cultural genocide and stuff. Yeah.
Right, yeah, and Ukraine is actually an extremely diverse territory.
Yeah.
I mean, a majority of the population are Ukrainian, and then there's a substantial minority of the Russian, but there's also like, Turkic Khalkhas people, there are Roma, there's tons of like, smaller minorities scattered around all over this place. So the ultimate losers in any kind of like anything that we do that actually supports a neo-Nazi slide, and if we continue to prop up this government and think only in terms of like Russia bad, therefore Ukrainian good, it feeds into Ukrainian nationalism, which ultimately can be turned on those minorities in those areas. And I worry about them. I worry about the impact on ordinary people in Ukraine, because it itself is also a multinational, multi-ethnic state.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so a couple questions. One is, do you have any recommendations for further reading books about, history books or political analysis books that kind of talk about that area, or about the Russian-U.S. or Russian-NATO conflict or anything like this?
Without knowing much more specifically the area of interest, I would struggle there, because most of the stuff that I have on Russia is very like specialized. It covers specific areas. I mean,
are there any fantastic reads
that minorities? Like I have books on Crimean Tatars and Siberian peoples and whatever. Like I have a lot of like really weird specialist stuff there. Like kind of like just holistically on relations between the U.S. and Russia, or
I would go as far as to say, name two or three that you just particularly found insightful that you would recommend?
Um,
Within the spectrum. Yeah, I see you have a library, yes.
yeah, no. What would be the most interesting? Okay, so I have a number here that do touch on the broader geopolitical conflicts.
Sure.
You know, the sort of like the various potential collisions that we have there, but I'm hesitant to recommend any of those because they all have one flaw or another based on the perspectives they're coming from. So while they'll touch on, they'll hit a really, really good point in one area, they're going to fall for some neoliberal bullshit on the other. You know, there's a real tendency in a lot of literature to fall into that binary when you're talking about the politics.
Like you'll always have that sort of bias, but you know, it's still would, you know, someone wants to do some further reading just to enrich their knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. Why don't I can like type up a small handful of good ones there that I think are just generally good books on.
Yeah, if you have some
Russia and Ukraine,
I can pass that along. Yeah.
And then we can just post somewhere there, but just
Absolutely.
make sure that there's the caveat that
Of
any
course.
one of these is going to have certain problems in.
And
And
if
it's only useful in certain contexts.
if you want to put those notes together, even of your critiques, that would be fine.
Like,
Absolutely.
I'm a big fan of like annotated bibliographies where
Yeah.
you point out, okay, this is good for this, but it's also really shit for this.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Let's see. Another question is, how do we as citizens try to limit, like these kinds of state interactions when they're inherent to having a state? Like, obviously, we can't exert that much control against the state individually, but what kind, like, I think this is kind of what leads into needing to unionize ourselves and organize ourselves ultimately, and educate each other.
Organize.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of discussions like that with my partner because we both have experience dealing with organizing and the different movement type politics. But they get to be really problematic because of the overall structure of the state. I mean, when people do manage to organize and then they start reaching out trying to build larger coalitions. I mean, look at what happened when you started to see broader cooperation between, say, like the Black Panthers and then, the poor white working class. Anytime you're trying to build larger solidarity organizations, it becomes an actual threat and state violence gets really significant. So I think the only real solution to that, the only way to help prevent it is baking solidarity into everything.
Mm-hmm.
So the more you can, the broadest framework you can to build more and more people out there. It's always tricky because mass movements tend to need a particular target, and then they can fall into infighting at the end of it. Look at, like, I don't know, the Iranian Revolution in '78. Tons of people that they hated each other, but they hated the Shah more. But it worked. Their mass movement, 2 million people in the streets in Tehran, you got rid of the Shah. The problem here is there wasn't a lot of effort to find any kind of common ground among the different groups.
Right.
So build a large enough mass movement to put people in the streets and keep them in the streets. You need to build not only bits of like intersectionality, bake it into it, but also a real ethos of solidarity where you can say, okay, yeah, I disagree with you on this, but not on this, and let's maintain friendly relations and work together going forward. This is the only way you're going to get movements to continue. Look at the fragmentation in the aftermath of the Egyptian uprising and all the infighting there, or look at how much Occupy just fizzled because it could never really get beyond a pretty small kind of like middle class, lower middle class base that was willing to like stand out there with signs and like honk for me, and like, okay, yeah, honk for change is not gonna change anything.
Right.
You need a mass movement. If we can get back to where we can link together groups like the American Indian Movement, Black Panthers, blah, 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 build these larger networks here, and then show up in the streets in force. There's something that you can see similar to that in just how many people you drew out for Black Lives Matter protests. Going back like a year and a half ago when you saw like a ton of people out in the streets.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the people did not agree with each other at all, but they did kind of agree that police violence is over the top.
Right.
And that there is a race problem in this country.
Yeah.
It was something. but you need to find some way to build stronger connections that go deeper, actual community organizing. And I think a lot of people, we love to bitch about stuff online or among our friends or whatever, but we don't want to put the real work into building true communal solidarity, like to actually reaching out to people. I think that at the end of the day, mutual aid societies are a really good way to build on a communal framework, but always, I don't know, what's the old like green slogan? Think globally, act locally.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of apply that to politics here. Like, think about how you can organize your own community, but always think about how you can relate to other groups, other struggles, other movements, and link them together. Such that when it comes time to actually protest something like a push to war, we can like flip a switch and we all still show up and we're there. So that's how we put pressure.
Basically, find a niche that your community can rally around, that you can build common ground with your neighbors on, get that support network going, and get everyone thinking in those sorts of terms, and then can redirect when,
but also cooperate.
Cooperate with other groups.
So you find, and a lot of people, sometimes in your particular group, you'll have people who can rally around a particular issue, and you'll be able to work together on something. But you're not all going to agree on everyone else's tactics in terms of other groups or other struggles, right? But you find the people that can straddle the fence there, that can be in your group and in someone else's group. And you cultivate those relations that way. You find people that can, walk those tightropes between the different movements and therefore provide linkages.
And ideally
build a larger framework.
Yeah, and ideally when you're doing that, you maybe even bring people in occasionally from other groups to work with you.
Share
introduced ideas, yeah.
Right. Because if you're just showing up and another group shows up just to help out with something, like in a particular movement, like, hey, we're going to do a food drive.
It builds camaraderie.
And people come there and you build a kind of like personal relationship. And over time, those personal relationships can help people see past a lot of the artificial differences that have been baked in. All the different, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, political, like all the different, policy issues people can rally around.
Yeah.
I mean, I just... we need to do better coalition building, and I think direct action in your communities is a really good way of doing that. As long as you are consciously planning to link up with other groups and find those people that can like go back and forth, and then call them together for larger actions. And in the process of that, you're building stronger linkages in a larger area. And then the edges of that, there's always somebody going farther and farther and farther out.
So be a Lego brick.
That's how we can get to a sustainable thing. Because I want to see mass movements in the U.S. I think without street politics, there's no way to ever correct the political corruption in our capitals.
Absolutely not.
I mean, until you can get millions of people in the streets demanding real change, it's not going to happen. And it can't just show up around a particular issue, and it can't be short term. We have to maintain that energy, which means we have to organize and create our own permanent groups in our communities and build beyond that.
Very good advice. Very good advice. Let's see. We did talk a little bit about we did talk fairly extensively about the distinctions between military and economic alliances, as well as how they overlap, because there's a lot of overlap. Koto Kano, I would recommend watching the full VOD a bit later on. I'll get it up on YouTube. Lyra asks a really interesting question that I don't actually know or couldn't begin to answer, which is how many countries are there out there which are like actually neutral as far as NATO and Russia, that are not in either sphere of influence?
Oh, jeez. So if we're thinking specifically around NATO, that kind of does keep us, in like, the Europe, it doesn't take us very far from Europe.
Okay.
Thinking of that way, if you're thinking in terms of like a little bit of a broader framework there, in terms of like not buying into, the propaganda from one side or the other and willing to trade on sides, the third worldism never went away. The non-aligned movement from the Cold War, it still is a thriving international movement. There are a lot of countries that are members of it and relate to it in various ways, and a ton of countries that are perfectly happy trading with all sides. I mean, India did that throughout the entire Cold War. There's a lot of countries that did that. And I don't think that idea has ever truly gone away. One of the real threats to it, and ultimately it'll trickle down into a social and cultural threat to erode this kind of idea, is that since you no longer have the big ideological and military struggle of the Cold War, it's the steady infiltration of neoliberal capitalism that starts pulling people away from that independent development ideal.
Yeah.
And a lot of international organizations never really took off. Like the African Union is, I mean, no offense, kind of a joke. It never really developed a real institutional foundation. It never really helped to integrate those territories, which means it can't really function to kind of like resolve conflicts, prevent violence, this and that. I think we needed a lot more things like that to have developed that could have been pushed back against it. Ultimately, the economic cleavages are why you have a hard time separating them, because the EU, for example, and NATO are quite different.
Right.
And a lot of the times the push to create a military component to the EU is basically like to say, oh, well, I guess we don't need NATO anymore. Maybe erode that. But ultimately what you'd end up with is then two of them. You can't really get rid of it in that sense, because the financial aspects overlap the two completely and end up linking them together. It's actually quite difficult to get out of this. There aren't that many countries anywhere that don't fall in one way or another into the broader international framework, and there's essentially none that escape the neoliberal framework. I mean, even countries like Cuba, that still have a relatively closed-off economy, are still kind of stuck, constantly trading with other states and interacting in a global financial world. The Soviet Union, at the height of the Cold War, never escaped it. I mean, the capitalist system suffuses the entire planet.
Yep.
So, as far as countries that don't buy into either NATO or Russia's rhetoric, there's plenty of those. I mean, you mentioned China already.
Yeah.
I mean, China definitely falls into that, where it's willing to play both camps, play both sides, and
as long as it's profiting.
As long as it benefits them.
Yeah.
They're thinking of their own interests.
Yeah.
And a lot of larger countries have an easier time doing that.
Yeah.
Playing both sides.
You mentioned India. I always find them kind of interesting because even though they do have some weird border stuff going on, it tends to stay pretty low key and go kind of underreported.
Which I've always struggled with. Why don't we talk more about? I mean, there's a serious nuclear risk there, and certainly a proliferation risk. There's constant skirmishes still.
Right.
And there have been several major wars that India's been involved in. Pay little attention to that.
Yeah, there's almost no reporting about India ever.
Yeah, I mean, what 1.2, 1.3 billion people.
It's a huge country.
Whatever, no big deal. We can safely ignore it. No, India's weak economically in many ways, but politically far more significant than people tend to think.
Yeah. Lyra, we did talk a little bit about how we are technically past the need for the military alliances, but that they are maintained and the tensions maintained for political and profit purposes. How at the end of the Cold War, and we talked about this at length, and can check that in the VOD, but how at the end of the Cold War, what we could have done is agreed to dissolve NATO as the Soviet Union itself dissolved and work to build each other up again, which would have been a much more constructive way.
Would have been.
From a humanitarian perspective.
Yeah. Alas, it was never really the point.
Right, yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I think this has been a very good and comprehensive discussion. I always find your thoughts very insightful and your perspectives very level-headed, and hopefully it was educational to everyone else, and I'll be cutting this out to YouTube, of course.
I honestly wish there was a lot more nuance in what people get from the media anyway. We sadly don't get much of that, so we have to find it for ourselves. So if this helps anybody, please just spread it around, talk more about it. I mean, this is not as black and white or simple as people tend to think. There's a lot of long-term issues that are caught up in this, and you're just not going to get that from corporate media because it's not really in their interests.
Absolutely.
To talk about this stuff anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll get the YouTube link up on Discord, but yeah, please do share it around, especially because, well, yeah, because it is does get talked about in very, yeah, black and white terms typically, you know.
Right.
All right, well, I appreciate you coming on, Liam. You've been fantastic. Chat, appreciate you all hanging out, asking your questions, and hope everyone learned something today. So yeah, appreciate you.
Thanks much. Yeah, always happy. Yeah. Have a great day, y'all.
Oh, actually, one last question. I couldn't find it off the top of my head. Do you have like you have your YouTube channel yourself? I think. I know you haven't been posting there too much recently, but
Yeah,
you do have one.
I do. Yeah, I'm going to be getting back to that. In fact, one of the first things I'm doing right now is I'm in the process of, and I've got another 7 of them scheduled in a row. There, I'm talking to a bunch of candidates, running in as insurgents and progressives around the country there to try and like, boost them a little bit, talk, go a little bit deeper than typical media interviews will with them. Yeah. But I'm going to get back to posting a lot of stuff on my own as well. My life just got sort of thrown into turmoil.
So
for a while.
So the URL.
The channel is Office Hours with the Mad Professor.
Office Hours with the Mad Professor.
Yeah. Let me see if I can. I think the short one actually does sort of have that. Let's see.
I got it.
Your channel there.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, there's a bunch of different like little playlists on there where different things show up based on what I'm talking about. And now that things are kind of starting to settle here, I mean, I ended up following a new relationship, in which looks like I'm actually getting married now, which is kind of cool. And then I settled into my house.
That's wonderful.
Hey, thanks. I mean, I'd lost my house and had to move here, and that's always a in the butt. I mean, you can't really see most of it in the room, but I mean, there's 34 bookcases in here.
Oof.
I mean, it's really complicated to set my office up right again and get, and there's tons of extra shelves all over the walls, like piling stuff in. It takes forever to sort things back out and replug things in. I finally got all my equipment back in place here, my desk set back up, so I'm going to start actually recording and editing again. So if anyone's interested in this kind of stuff, I will be, doing more content coming up here as I can squeeze it in among my teaching schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, that's really cool. Congratulations on getting married.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a lot of it was really kind of a surprise that it fell out that way. I'd kind of like given up hope for a while that that I was going to get back to that, and looks like we're gonna add on a few rooms in the back of the house here, and make this place a bit bigger, and I don't know, look for a family, and I don't know, it's kind of an interesting turn in my life.
Yeah, that's great.
So yeah, but I'm gonna be able to maintain that, and then still keep up with all the intellectual pursuits and whatnot. But yeah, you're right. The channel is gonna be one of those. Oh, it was a long gap, but I'm finally getting back to that.
Great, so. Excellent. Well, I mean, let me know if I can help out.
Thanks so much. This has always been fun.
Yeah, always good talking to you. Bye.
Have a good.